Captain Cook by Rebecca Levine. Chapter 1. Off to War. It was a frosty morning and the sun was rising through a haze of white mist as James Cook started work in the fields. He held tight to the reins of a shaggy brown horse as it tilled the earth, churning up dirt. James was only 8, so the horse towered above him, but the animal knew him well and didn't try to pull away. All around them, seagulls were pecking at the ground, hunting for worms. They had flown all the way from the coast to James's Yorkshire village, and at the end of the day they would fly all the way back again. James watched them go, desperately wishing he could follow. He longed to be a sailor, to cross the sea and visit faraway countries, especially countries no one had ever seen before. When he was just 18, part of his wish was granted. He was hired as an apprentice on a boat taking coal from Whitby, one of Britain's largest ports, to London. The other sailors complained about the back-breaking work and the coal dust that stained their hands and faces black. James was too thrilled with sailing to care. He became an expert at handling the flat-bottomed coal boats known as cats, and after 6 years he was promoted to ship's mate. It was a responsible job, but by now James wasn't so happy. When he dreamed of being a sailor, he had imagined exploring exotic new places, not sailing to and from smog-filled London. Eventually, at the age of 26, he decided to volunteer for the Royal Navy. His shipmates thought he was crazy. "Don't you know there's a war coming?" one of them asked. "You'll be killed for sure. And even if you aren't killed, you'll wish you were dead," another said. "Have you heard how they treat men in the Navy? They give you 12 lashes just for speaking out of turn." James wasn't put off. "I want to see the world," he told the others, "and joining the Navy is the best way to do it. Besides, if there is a war, I want to fight for my country." He didn't have to wait long. In May 1756, Britain and France declared war. 2 years later, the captain of James's ship called his crew together. "I've received new orders," he announced. "We're to sail with the fleet to the American colonies. We're taking the army to fight the French for control of the town of Quebec." To reach Quebec, they had to sail thousands of miles across the Atlantic. It was a terrible journey. Winds tore at the sails, and waves were so high they threatened to crash over the decks and wash everyone into the sea. Worst of all, many of the sailors were struck down by scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of fresh vegetables and fruit. It left the sailors so exhausted they could hardly move. As the weeks passed, more and more men died. At last, one morning, from high in the rigging, the lookout shouted, "Land ho!" They had reached the tree-lined coast of Canada. As the ship drew into shore, James felt a moment's panic. He knew the French army was waiting for them and would fight hard to hold on to their land. His fear was quickly replaced by a rising feeling of excitement. He had crossed an ocean and arrived on a new continent. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready. Chapter 2. Master Map Maker. Fierce fighting soon broke out between the British and French armies. Hundreds of soldiers on both sides were killed as the French defended a large fort at the mouth of St. Lawrence River. Finally, the British won and the sailors celebrated, singing and drinking. James was too worried to join in. "Enjoy yourself while you can," one of his shipmates told him. "We're about to take our soldiers up the river to Quebec itself." "That's not what I'm worried about," James admitted. "I've heard the river is filled with hidden rocks and we only have basic charts. Without a decent chart to guide us, our ships could sink." Luckily, a lieutenant in the British Army, Samuel Holland, had been charting the riverbank near the fort. When James shared his fears, Samuel agreed to teach him how to plot the layout of a riverbed. Feeling a little happier, James went to see the captain, who was pacing up and down in his cabin. I don't see how we'll ever get to Quebec in one piece, he groaned. Let me help, said James. If you can give me some time, I'll draw you a chart of the river all the way from here to Quebec. James was as good as his word. Despite freezing weather and the constant danger of French attacks, as they sailed up the St. Lawrence River, he managed to draw an approximate chart of the riverbed. Thanks to James, the British fleet reached Quebec unscathed. 3 years passed before the war ended and James could return to London. While there on leave, he met and married a young woman named Elizabeth. By the time he left her to return to his ship, she was pregnant with their first child. Over the next few years, James put his map-making skills to use as he charted the coast of Newfoundland, a part of Canada the British had won from the French. He was happy to be doing something so useful, and the more he worked, the greater his skill grew. Back in London, his officers had been talking about James's amazing talent. For many years, scientists in the Royal Society had been trying to discover how far the Earth was from the Sun. To find out, they needed someone to travel to the other side of the world and measure the position of the planet Venus at the exact moment it passed in front of the Sun. This was known as the transit of Venus, and it didn't happen very often. James seemed the perfect choice. He was summoned home to meet the Earl of Sandwich, the man in charge of the entire British Navy. James, the Earl declared, I need a talented navigator to measure the transit of Venus. How would you like to have command of your own ship and sail her to the South Seas? Really? James could hardly believe it. At last he'd be able to explore places no British person had ever visited. But you have to hurry, the Earl went on. If you don't reach the South Seas in time, there won't be another transit of Venus for 100 years.